So this is our video of the comparative method using inductive reasoning. When I talk about induction, what we're going to do is we're going to start with observations first, and then we're going to formulate our theory. So observation precedes theory. Observation to theory. The exact opposite of deductive reasoning, which is making a set of simplifying assumptions and then making your observations. So in the case of deductive reasoning, theory precedes observation. In the case of inductive reasoning, observation precedes theory. Okay, this is step one. Okay, so what you see before you is a graph of GDP per capita per region in the year 1820 and in the year 1998. Please excuse the Spanish. This image was downloaded free off of our friend Google Image. I think the original version actually came from a book by Jeffrey Sachs, and maybe part of the fair use is that it couldn't be reproduced in English, but it could be reproduced in Spanish. At any rate, this is a graph of GDP per capita in 1820 and 1998. What we do when we do the comparative method with induction is we start with some observation about the world around us that potentially is interesting. So just like if you were to make dinner and you looked at your pantry and you said, what looks interesting here, before deciding what you were going to craft for your meal, that's sort of what we're doing here with the comparative method. We have this interesting data before us, and we are going to start with a bunch of observations to formulate a testable hypothesis. Now, the focus of this particular video really is going to be hypothesis formation. It is going to be beyond the scope of the video to focus too much time and attention on step number 3, which is testing our hypothesis using data that already exists in the real world, largely because we are going to spend half a class period in about 2 weeks talking about how we are going to measure our independent variable of interest. So this is sort of a setup video for what we're going to be doing shortly in our course. To that effect, let's start with step 1. So let's start with our observations. What do we notice that's interesting about the graph before us? So, the first thing I actually noticed is that all regions are pretty poor in 1820. So let's look at, the 1820 case is the case of the light gray color. So if I had to estimate, I would say that the minimum probably is around 800 or so. I would say that Africa is pretty poor, and I would estimate Africa GDP per capita, it's about 800. Oh, let's see, this is in international US dollars in 1990. So approximately $800 a person in the region in 1990 dollars. All right. The richest region in the world appears to be Europe and Western Europe. And Western Europe, instead of Eastern Europe, so there's Western Europe first, Eastern Europe is second. In Western Europe, GDP per capita is roughly, I'm going to estimate it at $1,800. We're going to say the range is 1,000. So the first thing that I notice is not much variation in GDP per capita in 1820. I'm going to write that down because that could be interesting. I don't know, I'm just making observations. What's interesting here from which I will formulate a testable hypothesis. So in 1820, all regions poor. Not much variation. I'm going to say the min is 800, the max 1800, and we just say the range is 1,000. Okay, well, in 1998, I noticed that all regions got richer, although there's a lot more variation than in 1820. So Africa is still the poorest region, and now it's the United States, Canada, and interestingly, Oceania that is the richest region in terms of GDP per capita. So I will say, all regions got richer, although there is much more variation in 1998 than there is in 1820. It's going to be my second observation. 1998, all regions richer, more variation than in 1820. So let's just make this a little bit more formal. Minimum, let's see, at still Africa, I'm going to estimate that at about $1,500 US in 1990 terms per capita, so 1,500. The max, we're going to say that's the United States and Canada and Oceania. We're going to say that's, I don't know, I guess about 26,000. And so we will say range, there's a range here of 24,000. Okay, say we also know that total population of the world increased by quite a bit since 1820 and 1998. Interestingly, GDP per capita also increased. So what does this imply about the size of the economic pie? I say that it implies that the world got richer. So let's just say that that's our third observation, so total population of the world increased by quite a bit, and yet GDP per capita increased in every region. This leads me to the observation that the world got richer. So world got richer. Okay. Now what looks interesting here? I'm going to try and come up with a testable hypothesis given what I just observed about this chart in front of me. What's really interesting here for me is inequality is so much more marked in 1998 than it is in 1820. And so say we wanted to explain our dependent variable of interest, say we wanted to explain inequality as our dependent variable of interest. Now we have to make a hypothesis that's consistent with what we observed and yet still plausible. Our hypothesis doesn't have to be right, but it does have to be consistent with the observations in the step 1 of our comparative method. If, for example, I came up with a hypothesis that inequality increased solely because the West stole from Africa and Latin America, would this be consistent or inconsistent with what we observe? Well, I would say that that actually would be a bad hypothesis, inconsistent with the data, because the world actually got richer. So if we were to say the hypothesis that, the West got rich solely at the expense of Latin America and Africa, that would be at odds with the observation that we made that the world got richer. So that would not be a good hypothesis. That's probably not a good hypothesis for explaining variation in GDP per capita or explaining inequality. Let's say that I did want to make the hypothesis that inequality increased because some parts of the world industrialized and others did not. Would this be consistent with what we observe? Well, actually, yes, it would be. So we do know that Western Europe and the United States did industrialize way sooner than did sub-Saharan Africa. So let's say that that is the hypothesis that we're going to go with. I'm just going to write that here. Hypothesis, inequality increased because some parts of world industrialized first. So that is what my hypothesis is going to be, given what I observe and given what I have determined I think is interesting about this chart that we see before us. Now, step 3 would be using data that already exists in order to test whether or not my intuition about industrialization is correct. And as I said at the start of the video, we're going to spend half a class period on observing, measuring, quantifying, and testing this hypothesis using an article from The Economist. So comment out a period on this intuition, and we will spend time in the near future on step 3 of this particular hypothesis. Hopefully this gives you a little bit of an intuition about the comparative method using induction, where we use observations in order to create our hypothesis. Observation here is preceding our theory. And that's all I have for now. All right.